Our next speaker is Lance Humphries, who received his doctorate in art history from the University of Virginia, where his dissertation explored the art and architectural patronage of Robert Gilmore, Jr. of Baltimore, who was one of the most important art collectors in 19th century America. Lance is an Americanist who has lectured and published on Gilmore, on the Peel family of artists, and on Baltimore furniture. From 2006 to 2010, he was a consultant on the refurnishing of James Madison's mansion Montpelier, focusing on the artwork believed to have been displayed there. At Montpelier, Lance also assisted in the development of the research structures needed to guide the restoration of an historic landmark, a role he has more recently filled at Homewood House Museum in Baltimore. In addition to this, Lance was a Leon Levy Fellow at our Center for the History of Collecting, where he did more in-depth research on Robert Gilmore, and Lance has spoken at several of our center symposia on Gilmore. At present, Lance is working on a study of the Baltimore townhouse from 1780 to 1860. He has recently published an essay on Career and Hastings' City Beautiful designs for Baltimore in a landscape anthology publication of the National Gallery of Art. In addition to his scholarly work, Lance is a founding board member of the Mount Vernon Place Conservancy, the first park conservancy in the city of Baltimore. For the past 7 years, he chaired the Conservancy's Restoration Committee and its recent award-winning restoration of the Washington Monument. Since January 2015, Lance has been the executive director of the Conservancy. Today, Lance will speak once again about Robert Gilmore, and this time about his quest for Flemish paintings. Please welcome Lance.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be back here at the Frick. I have to say of that previous talk, so that was a big wow. Now you all need to kind of pause and reset your expectations because we're going back 200 years and things were a lot different 200 years ago, and kind of the issues and challenges of understanding what was here 200 years ago is a much different story than what's here now. So in the federal period, the collection of Robert Gilmore Jr. of Baltimore was one of the most noted in the United States. Over approximately 50 years of collecting, beginning in 1797, Gilmore acquired and commissioned around 400 paintings. He is often remembered as one of the first major patrons of the rising school of American artists and sculptors, and this accolade is notable. But Gilmore believed that American art would emerge out of the artistic traditions of the old world, and that for our school to emerge, the works of the old masters needed to be available for study. A remarkable amount of information is known about Gilmore and his collecting, as he kept a manuscript catalog, and you're seeing the first page here, detailing usually the size, artist, and provenance of each work. This surviving record of provenance is highly unusual in 19th century America. His collection included paintings from the highly sought-after Flemish, Dutch, and Italian 17th century schools, as well as some other schools and periods. Of the paintings he owned, about 60 he believed were Flemish. By comparison, he thought he had over 130 Dutch paintings. Understanding Gilmore's or any pre-Civil War American collection, and I'm really focusing on before the 1840s, is challenged by their dispersal before the era of photography and the advances in scholarship it made possible. Although at the end of Gilmore's life, he hoped the newly formed Smithsonian Institution would acquire his various collections as the nucleus of a national museum, and we just heard this theme before. The Smithsonian at the time was not interested in collection building. When he died in 1848, several years after this little miniature here, Gilmore's collection was largely divided between his wife and 3 nephews, but as they died, their collections were dispersed. Gilmore Jr. was born in Maryland, the son of Robert Gilmore Sr., who emigrated from Scotland to Maryland before the Revolutionary War. Eventually settling in the emerging city of Baltimore, Gilmore Sr., at the conclusion of the war, entered into business with William Bingham in Philadelphia at upper right, one of the richest men in late 18th century America. Through these connections, Gilmore Sr., who had only a mild interest in art collecting, became an American representative of the House of Baring in London. With these connections, young Gilmore Jr. matured in a world at the pinnacle of Anglo-American merchant wealth. At a young age in the 1790s, Gilmore embarked on a lifetime of collecting interests. He would assemble some of the earliest known American collections of minerals, ancient and modern coinage, manuscripts, illuminated medieval manuscripts, and ancient Greek pottery. In several cases, including the manuscript and this Greek pottery, these are the earliest known examples in this country. These collections augmented his art, which largely embraced paintings, drawings, and prints, and a handful of sculptures. Gilmore's art collecting was influenced by that of his British business peers, such as the Barings, who were also painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence, well known for their fine art collections. He was aware of not only his financial limitations, but the challenges of collecting art here in this period, observing near the end of his life that his collection was, quote, no doubt equal, if not superior, to most in the country, both for numbers and originality. Yet one good picture of a London cabinet would be worth the whole, unquote. Gilmore acquired paintings from friends, artists acting as dealers, and from auctions up and down the East Coast, as will be seen. On his grand tour of Europe in 1799-1801, he bought only several works and at very modest prices. When he returned to Europe in 1817-18, he acquired about 50 pictures, apparently realizing that the supply in the United States was limited. He attended several auction sales in London, and notably, he and his wife were painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence, indicating his high social status in the Anglo-American world. Once he returned to the United States, Gilmore was limited to the random nature of paintings that arrived on these shores, with one exception. Beginning in the early 1820s, Cornelis Apostol, the director of the Rijksmuseum, began to ship him paintings, eventually totaling around 20 works, largely from the Dutch school. I mean, this is kind of an unheard of thing to say that like the director of the National Gallery is going to send someone paintings. They were not things that he wanted for the museum. They were extras that he did not need. Newspaper advertisements and surviving auction catalogs indicate that there were old master and modern works available here, but one did not have the opportunity to shop around for the best work by any given artist on the market, as one could much more easily after the advent of photography and the printing of illustrated catalogs. For instance, by 1898, one could choose from a dozen Van Dycks offered for sale by Sedlmayr, just one dealer's offerings, some but not all with their attributions intact to this day, and as you see, the National Gallery's Van Dyck is there at the top. Only several American pre-Civil War collections offer a hope of being the winner of such accolades as possessing authentic works by Rubens and Van Dyck, and Gilmore knew and saw them. And those I will mention held great mystique in this period. In 1794, as you heard, Henri Stier fled Belgium with his family and art collection of over 60 paintings. The Stiers lived in several cities, but eventually Stier built a mansion several miles outside of Washington, where the paintings were eventually under the care of his daughter Rosalie Stier Calvert after Stier returned to Belgium in 1803. The collection had authentic works, as you saw, by Van Dyck and Rubens. However, except for some very small pieces, including a handsome Jan Bruegel the Elder, the collection was in storage crates the entire time it was here and seen by no one. Gilmore knew the Stier family personally, and likely may have seen it during its brief viewing before being returned to Belgium in 1816. Whether we can call this an American collection is debatable, as it was really just here in storage, a most unusual occurrence, but it was a sensation among those select few who knew about it and were lucky enough to see it in 1816. Other collections Gilmore knew included that owned by Joseph Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon, who came into exile in this country in late 1815. He brought with him, by all contemporary accounts, a magnificent collection, not surprising given his reach while King of Spain. On several occasions, Gilmore saw Bonaparte's collection either at his home near Bordentown, New Jersey, or when pieces from it were on display at various exhibitions. Surprisingly, considering its potential importance, the works Bonaparte had with him here have never been reassembled, and Bonaparte also owned a number of paintings that never were brought to America. By the time it was first offered for sale in 1845, he had no works attributed to Van Dyck, but a number given to Rubens and Snyders, and they were usually joint attributions, several to Teniers, and others just given to the Flemish school. Many hunting and fowling pieces, and, somewhat unusual to our eyes, a large still life with Christ and St. John, given at the time to Rubens and Snyders, but now attributed solely to Snyders. However, before this final dispersal, Gilmore had acquired a work from Bonaparte through circuitous means, which I will discuss in a moment. Another collection actually assembled by an American, Richard Warsom Mead, while he was a consul in Spain, numbered about 100 works. After the Peninsular Wars, Mead returned with the collection to the United States and this portrait by Lopez, and eventually he and his wife split their time between Philadelphia and Washington. As with a handful of collections in this country at this time, there were some treasures among the group, including with certainty an enormous canvas by Luca Giordano and very likely this still life by Cotin. Mead's Flemish paintings, including works given to Rubens, Van Dyck, and Teniers, remain unlocated, and their appearance unknown. These dispersal riddles really beg the question, what was here to look at or to purchase? Gilmore, largely collecting in the United States, had few frames of reference for authentic works by Flemish masters, in particular the great masters Rubens and Van Dyck, other than his memory of paintings he saw in Europe and, of course, prints. Although Gilmore considered himself an able connoisseur, and others recognized his abilities, including Apostol, as well as actually Henri Stier, that he saw the collection, actually it was back in Antwerp. All in this period were hampered by the state of scholarship. Gilmore relied heavily on prints to understand attributions. Bernard Berenson, writing in 1893, stated that, quote, really accurate connoisseurship, unquote, based on photographic reproductions was then a new science. Quote, the connoisseurs and art historians, therefore, who had to depend on prints, no matter how good a general notion of a painter's various compositions they might have drawn from this source, could have next to no acquaintance with those subtlest elements in his style which distinguished him from the mere copyist or clever imitator, unquote. Because of these challenges, Gilmore's Old Master collection is a mixed bag of quality and attribution. But this was likely the state of most collections at this time, except for those owned by the most wealthy of collectors in Europe and those with access to a large supply. Despite these challenges, Gilmore amassed some handsome Old Master paintings, particularly by Dutch masters. A previous Frick symposium focused on American collecting of Dutch art, in particular the work of Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Hals. Gilmore likely did not own any authentic works by these artists, and although while his generation was certainly interested in Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Hals were less known. If some of his Dutch paintings did not survive with excellent provenance, we would, however, likely not believe that Gilmore could have owned Schalken's handsome and very large self-portrait or Mignon's beautiful still life, both of which arrived in Charleston via a shipwrecked cargo off Cuba. or that he owned the earliest documented Jacob van Ruysdael landscape in this country, acquired at auction in London in 1818, among other handsome Dutch pictures. Gilmore's interest in Flemish art was influenced by the literature and prints produced about it by the British. On his first trip to Europe, while at Chirk Castle in 1799, he observed that he saw there a version of Rubens' self-portrait, noting that he had Whirlige's 1757 print of the work in his collection. Over his lifetime, he likely collected hundreds of prints, and unfortunately they were never cataloged, as he eventually described it as forming a history of the art of printing. He also perused print collections of dealers and friends and asked them to research in their collections. Gilmore also relied on publications like Pilkington's Dictionary of Artists and emerging catalogs such as William Buchanan's 1824 Memoirs of Painting and John Smith's Catalogue Raisonné. However, Smith's work was mostly devoted to Dutch artists, including only 4 Flemish painters, Rubens, Van Dyck, Teniers, and González Cocas, as it did not begin to appear until 1829 and was not illustrated. It could not help Gilmore too much with the attribution of paintings. Publications like John Young's catalogs of the Philip John Miles collection and Grosvenor House collections, published in the early 1820s, provided him with images, to be sure, rudimentary, by which he could think about painting attributions. And Gilmore owned all of these publications that I'm mentioning here, really quite soon after they were published. Gilmore hoped to have works by Rubens and Van Dyck, but most works he gave to these artists remain unlocated today. Their contemporary fame led to many copies and even more complicating prints after their work. Unknown to Gilmore, or for that matter to any collector in any country or city, was the current home of a given painting depicted in some 50-year-old print. On a number of occasions, he referenced prints and that a painting in his collection resembled an engraved work. With these challenges, Gilmore's success in acquiring works by the premier Flemish artists of this period was limited, although he was able to acquire some interesting works. And I just have to say that you're going to be confused about this image for just a second, but it will all become clear in a moment. One of Gilmore's earliest acquisitions, thought to be from the Flemish school, was a pair of portraits his father acquired for him in 1799 from an auction of a German family then in Baltimore. At the time of the sale, and apparently throughout Gilmore's lifetime, he attributed them to Gaspard de Cryer. However, perhaps strangely, at an early date, he noted that there were pictures almost precisely like the pair in the Grosvenor collection, identified there as by Rembrandt and depicting, so they thought at the time, the artist Berchem and his wife, and they are shown here. He would have known the Grosvenor pictures from these very rudimentary prints from the 1820 catalog. The pair are no longer given to Rembrandt and are not well known in surviving copies, which has led me to wonder how similar Gilmore's pictures were. Could they have been copies of another pair well known to exist in various copies? How almost precisely like were they? And I think this is an interesting story about, obviously Gilmore attributed his pictures to a Flemish artist and had no problem saying that they look like Rembrandt. But these definitions, I think, as actually Arthur alluded to, they're much more fuzzy in the early 19th century than they are now. Over his lifetime of collecting, Gilmore had 6 or 7 paintings he thought were by Rubens. 3 of them were on the theme of Diana hunting and were on copper. 2 other historical works, A Christ and the Adulteress and the Tribute Money, are poorly documented. These all likely seem to have been copies from works possibly after prints, and I just showed you the Miles version of the Adulteress, actually. In other cases, the existence of prints discouraged him from making attributions. Around 1823, Gilmore acquired a picture in New York that was likely a variation or copy of Rubens' Holy Family, now in the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection, shown here. This is the original. However, as he noted in his catalog, he doubted its originality, his own picture, as he found a work precisely like it in the Houghton collection, there attributed to Thomas Boscard. Nearly 200 years later, versions of this painting still emerge on the market, lacking an understanding that they are based on the Rubens composition. And I'm showing you most recently, this was sold in 2007, given to the Flemish artist Biscay, with no knowledge that it was after a Rubens composition. But we have much more ready access to online images for comparison. Likely Gilmore's best work relating to Rubens was the Holy Family Reposing he acquired at Christie's in London in 1818, the same sale at which he acquired his Ruysdael. Consigned by noted dealer William Buchanan and said to be formerly in the collection of Alexis de la Hante, it remains unlocated. Gilmore described it in his catalog as a, quote, repose in Egypt or Holy Family, with Joseph and Mary, Zacharias and Elizabeth, Christ and St. John, a fine specimen of coloring. The Virgin is a portrait of the artist's wife, unquote. John Smith, in his catalog, did not include this work, and as he didn't include this Ruysdael either, the sale was apparently not known to him. Gilmore's picture's provenance is confused by a work also owned by both Buchanan and de la Hante, now in the Wallace collection. However, Gilmore noted that his picture included 6 figures, so it was not the Wallace picture or a close replica. The dealer pair were obviously noted and well-informed, and Gilmore valued this work as the most valuable in his collection. Unfortunately, its provenance grows cold after it was bequeathed to his wife. Gilmore noted that it was painted on a panel composed of 6 pieces, an unusual amount of detail that one day might mesh with a related painting, and perhaps masquerading as by some other Flemish artist. Gilmore recorded that he had 7 works thought to be by Van Dyck, one of which he understood to be a copy, actually a copy after the Cardinal Bentivoglio portrait out in the exhibition, most of which of his pictures, unfortunately, remain unidentified. In the late 1820s, he saw on exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts 2 portraits given to Van Dyck and identified as Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He acquired them from the current owner, a wealthy Philadelphian with surviving written documentation, and actually this documentation survives to this day, that they had been acquired in Spain by an ancestor in the 1790s. And you note how many times I've mentioned Spain. I think it's a very interesting part of this story. While in Philadelphia, the paintings were seen by Charles Wilson Peale, Gilbert Stuart, and Henry Inman, most of whom agreed they were by Van Dyck. At the time Gilmore acquired them, Baltimore artist Alfred Jacob Miller copied the pair, seen here, and fortunately his copies survive, as they form the basis for understanding what Gilmore's paintings look like. And so when I found these, this was kind of like the early version of the Frick. It was wonderful to find these examples, and they were exhibited from Miller's collection, actually saying that they were copied from the paintings in Gilmore's collection, which is really an amazing story in itself. But by the late 19th century, the actual paintings were back in Europe, passing through Sadelmeyer's hands in 1898 in the catalog I showed you. No longer identified as a pair, the now unknown man retained his attribution to Van Dyck, while the woman was given to Cornelis de Vos and retained a vestige of her former identity in being called a Bourbon princess. They can only be traced into the early 20th century and remain unlocated, although recently I confirmed their attribution to Gaspard de Cryer with Hans Fliege. So Gilmore's Van Dycks were actually Gaspard de Cryers, and his Gaspard de Cryers were, who knows, something that looked like a Rembrandt. Very confusing. Gilmore, on any number of occasions, noted that he preferred cabinet-sized paintings. So the presence in his collection of several large works by Franz Snyders is somewhat surprising. The earliest to enter his collection was a painting he called The Owl's Sermon to the Birds. This large work, it's about 6 feet tall, he acquired around 1820 while in Boston at the sale of the then Boston Museum. This museum, similar to the Peale Museums in Philadelphia and Baltimore, served as not only a gallery of paintings and other objects, but a showroom where private individuals or the handful of then art dealers could place works on display. When Gilmore acquired this picture, he attributed it to the school of Rubens. However, by the end of his life, he had attributed it to Snyders, a position it still holds in the literature. Prints from the Houghton collection, which he clearly saw, may have assisted in the identification, although confusingly, the Houghton print was mistakenly credited as being after an Italian artist, and the original of this painting by Snyders is still at the Hermitage. Gilmore's picture was last known when acquired by the Broad Gallery in London in 1967. So if anybody's seen it, I'd love to know about it. Gilmore also owned 2 other large works given to Snyders. One, unlocated, described as heroic, was a large market scene with a woman, a typical Snyders composition, although it easily could have been by one of his contemporaries. Gilmore's last Snyders, A Stag Hunt, had a terrific provenance, having come from Joseph Bonaparte's collection. In 1832, Gilmore encouraged Bonaparte to send a dozen works to Peale's Baltimore Museum. Among the paintings was the Stag Hunt given to Snyders. Reviewed in the newspapers, it was admired for its ferocious display of nature. In Bonaparte's collection, it may have formed an informal mate to another Snyders of identical size, which has just emerged with strong provenance to Bonaparte's 1845 dispersal sale. At the end of the Baltimore exhibition, Joseph gave the painting to his nephew, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of Baltimorean Betsy Patterson Bonaparte. The younger Jerome quickly sold it to Gilmore, who almost immediately found he didn't have room for it, and lent it to his sister-in-law. It went through several Gilmore family collections before finally being sold in New York in 1914, as illustrated here. It appears to be the work John Ringling shortly thereafter purchased for his museum. In the mid-20th century, it was recognized that the Ringling picture is a partial replica of a signed Paul de Vos in Belgium, so no longer Snyders. But, as it turns out, a similar version has been in the French royal collection since the 18th century. They're also originally given to Snyders. So if European kings couldn't get it right, Merchant Gilmore in Baltimore was not doing too bad. And I have to say, based on the quality of these reproductions, and actually maybe even just the condition of these paintings, that we appear to be at the nadir of interest in Paul de Vos stag hunt pictures. But you can see that this is a very popular type of picture in the early 19th century, and just these small groups of collections I'm talking about. Many of Gilmore's genre, still life, and landscape paintings by Flemish artists are poorly documented beyond his lifetime, with several exceptions. He believed he owned landscapes by several artists somewhat unusual in the canon today, including Jacques Dartois and Francisque Millet. The latter's large landscape with grand architecture, shown here, was acquired in New York from the collection of John Jacob Astor and had been purchased in Paris by John Vanderlyn for Aaron Burr. More canonical artists like David Teniers and Jan Bruegel were also represented. Teniers was highly admired during Gilmore's lifetime and was among those cataloged by John Smith. Gilmore believed he owned 6 works by Teniers, including several landscapes with figures. His earliest recorded acquisition took place in 1818 while in Paris, where he acquired an extremely small work. This is about 6 by 8. I'm sorry to have this huge image of it, which he believed to be a self-portrait. Unsigned, the picture retains the Teniers attribution, but is no longer thought to be his own likeness. Gilmore's finest surviving Teniers he acquired in New York in 1823 from the artist John Trumbull, a Judith with the head of Holofernes. Trumbull informed Gilmore at the time of purchase of his own acquisition of the work in Paris in the late 1790s, where though he believed it a fine painting, quote, the dead man's head reminded everyone so thoroughly of the guillotine as to render the picture with all its merits unpopular and unsaleable, unquote. This work went through one of Gilmore's nephew's collections before finding its way to a New York collector and eventually the Metropolitan. Also, while in Paris in 1818, Gilmore acquired a work he described as an allegory of the elements and attributed to Jan Bruegel the Elder with figures by Hendrik van Balen. That attribution has changed in 200 years to Bruegel II, but it remains a remarkable painting. Gilmore's generation delighted in the detail of this kind of work, considering it a wonderment. His Philadelphia collecting associate, Charles Graff, after seeing the work, observed that this picture depicting, quote, animals, birds, reptiles, shells, flowers, etc., 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 would afford endless amusement in the examination of the hundreds of objects it contains, and all of them beautifully executed, unquote. Knowledge of Gilmore's Flemish paintings remains fragmentary and somewhat frustrating, considering how many works remain unlocated or unidentified. However, as a well-documented American collection by American standards, it and the others he knew readily document the strong interest in paintings from the Flemish school and the challenges those faced in the early 19th century to acquire authentic works. Thank you.